Minutes to let a few more people in. We've got about 49 at this point, and we've had over 90 who have registered, which is really exciting. We are going to ask you to put any questions you have into the chat. And for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with Zoom, the chat is on the bottom. You'll just put your cursor along the bottom, you'll see it, and you can put the chat questions in. Caitlin will be putting them onto a spreadsheet, and then we'll be asking them all at the end. So we're going to wait till the end for all questions. Nice to see some familiar faces there, actually a lot of familiar faces. I think we'll probably give it till about 5 after, just to make sure everybody gets in. Again, thanks for coming, everybody. We appreciate it. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Okay. Well, it's a beautiful day in Rochester. The snow is so white and fluffy. Standing here at Warner Castle, and the trees are covered with snow. It's just beautiful. I hope it's nice where all of you are. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. This is where I always say there should be some music playing while we're all waiting. We do ask that you keep yourselves muted and put questions into the chat box. I'll go over that again in another minute when we start. We're just about there. I want to give everybody a chance to get in. We are just about there. Perfect. 12:05, we're going to start. Okay. So, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Larry Francer. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Associate Director at the Landmark Society of Western New York, and we are very pleased to welcome all of you to our Giver Grant Workshop, the Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization Grants. We call them Giver Grants because it makes us feel good to be able to give money to all of our rural friends for great projects. I'm going to turn it over in just a minute to my colleague Caitlin Mivas, and then we'll sort of go down the line and introduce all of ourselves. But just to go over couple of housekeeping things. We prefer you to be muted the whole time if possible. Well, I think it is possible. So please be muted the whole time until we get to the end. And any questions you have, please put them in the chat box. For those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, you just take your cursor along the bottom and the little chat comes up and you click on that and you can put in your questions to everyone, or if you have a specific question that you want to put into anybody else, like to say hello to somebody, you can do that as well. So all I want to say is that we really are thrilled to have you here. We're very excited to be partnering with the Office of Historic Preservation, Archaeology, and Historic Preservation, the State SHPO office on this amazing opportunity for Western New York and our rural communities. This is a wonderfully put together PowerPoint. Megan has done a great job. The one thing I want to say is please don't be overwhelmed. There's a lot of information. It's a fairly straightforward application, but for some of you, it might feel a little overwhelming. Well, that's why we're here. That's why the Landmark Society has this position to be working with all of you and to make it easy for you. So any questions you have, please contact us directly afterwards if you need to, but we want to give you the money. We don't want to make it difficult for you. We want you to be able to do wonderful projects. So with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin, who can introduce herself, and we'll be starting in just a minute.
Good. I was just checking the clock to see if it was a good afternoon or good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin Mivas. I'm the Director of Preservation at Landmark Society. I will be, like Larry said, we'll be holding questions until the end, but just put as we go, as your questions occur to you, just put them in the chat. I'll be collecting them and we will go through every single question at the end. And then I'll turn it over to our colleague Megan to introduce herself. And then we will also introduce our colleague at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Preservation. So Megan, you're up.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Clem and I'm the Preservation Planner with the Landmark Society. I'll be administering this Giver Grant program, and then I also work with our fee-for-service and old house help programs at the Landmark Society. And then I will send it over to Fran.
Hi everyone, I'm Fran Stern from the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. I am a historic site restoration coordinator at OPRHP, but I work specifically in the grants and homeowner tax credit unit. So this Paul Bruhn Giver Grant program is our unit's responsibility, and my role here is to help with all of the sort of nitty-gritty contracting and National Park Service details. So because the thing is that this is a grant program where we want to give you all money to do awesome projects, but this is also a grant that the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation has received. So I'm just going to kind of be on the back end, making sure that all of our requirements, and if there's any questions that we can't answer today, then we will definitely be able to find the answers to them. So feel free to contact me with stuff like that. So take it away.
We'll get the presentation started. In this presentation, we're going to cover what the grant program is, the eligibility requirements, and I'll walk you through the application process itself. So as we've already mentioned before, to ensure the best delivery of information, if everyone can make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation, that way we avoid any feedback coming through. And also remember that you can type in your questions into the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This program is funded by the Paul Bruhn Historic Revitalization Grants Program through the Historic Preservation Fund, and it's administered by the National Park Service within the Department of the Interior. The Historic Preservation Fund was founded in 1976 and aims to provide preservation grants and financial assistance to state and local governments, nonprofits, and others to contribute to the preservation of the built environment and archaeological resources. The Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization Grant, or GVRR for short, is administered by the Landmark Society of Western New York, a Rochester-based nonprofit preservation organization, and the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Grants will be awarded in amounts between $5,000 and $50,000 for capital historic rehabilitation projects in rural communities in the Finger Lakes and Western New York regions. The purpose of the GVRR grant is to help preserve the historic places that have shaped our rural communities, their social fabric, and the economy. There are a number of benefits that awardees will receive aside from the funding itself. Awardees will receive membership to the Landmark Society's affiliate program for the duration of their grant project. And this program provides a network of support to grassroots organizations and individuals doing local preservation work. Members of the affiliate program receive priority status for consultation with the professionals at the Landmark Society, as well as connections with numerous preservation-oriented organizations, contractors, and other related professionals. The Landmark Society will be holding networking events during discussion sessions on a regular basis for grant recipients to learn from each other and other affiliate members, and the events will be held virtually. And finally, one of the most beneficial benefits of this program is the potential for more properties to become listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Properties listed in the National Register can take advantage of the New York State and federal historic tax credit programs and other preservation-oriented funding programs. Now that you know a little bit about what the GVRR grant program is, we will move into who and what is eligible. Eligible and building types include historic commercial, industrial, civic, educational, or community-oriented buildings that are located within one of the 12 listed counties spanning the Finger Lakes in Western New York. These are listed on your screen right now. They must also have a public or community use. State or federally owned buildings and privately owned owner-occupied residences are not eligible for this grant program. The purpose of the grant is to reach the more rural and isolated communities, which requires the buildings to also be located within an incorporated village with a population of 4,000 people or less, or within a town that has a population of 10,000 people or less. The building must also be currently listed or determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or within a historic district. Again, if your building is National Register listed, you're all set to go. If you are not National Register listed or you're not sure, please contact me via email, and you'll get my email address at the end of the presentation. We will help you get that with that determination process. So if you don't have a determination yet, you may still be eligible for this program. The second point of eligibility is the applicant entity. So the GVRR program is geared towards community-based nonprofits, local governments such as villages, towns, or counties, business owners who operate within a historic building and have the permission of the legal building owner to apply, and other non-residential property owners who own an eligible building type, as previously discussed. Due to the nature of this program, funding, private residential homeowners and state and federal agencies are not eligible for this grant program. And finally, eligible projects. The GVRR grant program will fund capital rehabilitation and restoration projects. This includes work such as roof replacements, masonry repair, window repair, or replacements when appropriate, and storefront restorations, weatherization such as storm windows or window repair to properly fit the openings. And then measures to bring a building into compliance with ADA requirements. and systems upgrades, which includes installation or upgrades to your plumbing, electrical, and mechanical systems. Grant funds can also be used towards the completion of cultural resource surveys, which provide an overview of historic properties and structures or objects that have a potential for National Register listing. And finally, a portion of the grant funding may be used to cover soft costs, such as construction documents and conditions assessments. It's important to note that architectural or engineering fees and plans and specification costs cannot exceed 20% of the total grant amount. Ineligible projects include site work, landscaping, furnishing spaces, and lighting systems that are not permanently attached to the building. An example of a lighting system that would not be eligible would be lighting in a theater. While the lighting is not eligible, the apparatus that is installed that becomes part of the building may be an eligible expense. In general, think of your capital expenses as work and materials that you would not be able to take with you if you were to vacate the property. Prior to completing this and submitting the application, you'll want to ensure your project meets the eligibility criteria. We've already discussed the location and National Register requirements, as well as the grant funding range between $5,000 and $50,000. Other important aspects to be aware of prior to submitting the application include the project completion, which the grant funded project should be able to be completed within a 2-year period, which will be confirmed during the grant agreement process after awardees have been announced. Extensions may be considered on a case-by-case basis as long as the project is still moving forward. Project compliance. The work to be undertaken will need to conform with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which we'll discuss further later on in the presentation. And finally, a preservation covenant. Projects that are funded through the Giver grant will need to agree to a term preservation covenant on the property. Covenants are an agreement between the property owner and the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, that work during the covenant period will comply with the standards. In general, a property owner will only need to consult with the SHPO on work during this period if it's something beyond general maintenance of the building, such as an addition or significant changes. The covenant is placed on the property deed. So if you were to sell the property while the covenant is still in place, this covenant would then transfer to the new owner. The purpose of the covenant is to protect the state and federal investment in your property for the period specified in the grant agreement. The length of the covenant, again, is based on the amount of grant funding that you receive. Awardees must also adhere to a few conditions of the grant when accepting the funding. Since the Giver program is funded through federal monies, projects are required to use a competitive bidding process when hiring consultants and contractors. Both state and federal grant funding also require a term preservation covenant, as previously discussed, and signage indicating the grant funding for a set period of time during and after the project. Signage guidelines will be made available to awardees during the grant agreement process. And finally, property owners are encouraged to pursue a National Register of Historic Places listing if the property is not already designated. For properties that would be eligible within a historic district, the landmark staff and SHPO staff will work with you and your municipality to discuss options and the process. And if we can just make sure that everybody is muted, we're getting a little bit of feedback. We'll now transition into an in-depth discussion on the application form and process. For those of you who have not already received the application and instructions, please reach out to me via email to request a copy either during or after this presentation. As this is an electronic submission, again, email is going to be the best way to receive this application, and I can be reached at mclem@landmarksociety.org. And you will also see my email on the final slide during our question and answer session. This application can be completed and signed electronically through Adobe Acrobat software. And while you're welcome to complete and sign the application by hand, you would then need to scan it back in as a PDF and submit it through email. We encourage you to complete the application electronically, but if you choose to complete it by handwriting, we do ask that everything be clear and legible. It's important to read through the application instructions that you'll be given with the application form. This document contains detailed information and clarification on what is requested in the form and is broken down by section. So theoretically, you could just look for the section you need assistance with. And I know the application instructions can seem daunting, but they are there to help you through the application form itself. If the instructions have not answered your questions or you need further clarification, please reach out to the Landmark staff at any time. We're here to answer your questions and provide assistance throughout this process. There will be 2 funding rounds for the GVRR grant program. Round 1 applications are due March 31st, 2021, and round 2 applications will be due September 30th, 2021. It's important to note that the application you're receiving now is for round 1 funding. There will be another application that goes out when round 2 funding becomes available. All right, in section 1 of the application, you'll provide general information on the historic property for which you're applying for the grant. The property name refers to a commonly known historic or other name. However, if the building does not have a commonly known name or you aren't aware of one, you can either come up with a name of your choosing, or you can leave that line blank. You'll also include other information on the historic, current, and proposed uses of the building, the date of construction, and whether the property is listed in the National Register as either an individual property or within a historic district. The application instructions provide steps to find out if your property is listed if you aren't sure. However, if unsure, please do contact the Landmark staff, myself. We're always here to help, and we can find you that information fairly quickly. You will also see a section on determination of eligibility for properties that are not currently listed. You don't need to worry about filling out this section, but if your property is not listed or you're not sure, please reach out to me within the next week or so. We do want to put you on a list to go through a determination of eligibility process, which Landmark staff and SHPO staff will help you through. But we do want to get that process moving so that we can hopefully have those determinations made by the March 31st deadline, or before we have to finalize our reviews of your applications. Section 2 is all about collecting contact information. We will need to know who the applicant or applicant organization is, basically who is the entity applying for the funding. You will also need to apply or to provide contact information for the applicant or applicant organization and project contact. The applicant contact should be somebody associated with the applicant or applicant organization who will receive all of the mailed and emailed communication from us. Your project contact needs to be someone who will be able to answer our questions about the project, the application, and who will be able to schedule site visits with our staff. This could be the same person as your applicant or organization contact. If you'll be pursuing a historic district National Register nomination or a multi-property survey in connection with your personal project, you should you'll need to provide a contact person within your municipality. They will become our contact to discuss any multi-property or district-wide nominations in coordination with you. This section will also ask for you to check your applicant status, such as a 501c3 or a nonprofit organization, a unit of local government, or a private property owner. You will also need to include the legal building owner's contact information, along with a letter of consent if you are not the legal owner of the building that you're applying for funding. And lastly, this section asks for information on any local historic society, preservation-oriented organization, or development organization in your community, town, or village. This information will allow the Landmark Society to update and expand our partnerships and to ensure future opportunities like this can be widespread so people know about them. Section 3 is about the property and the project. As a federally and state funded grant, all work taking place to the property, whether eligible for the grant or not, or receiving grant funding or not, will need to comply with the Secretary's standards. To ensure this is the case and avoid any potential issues at the end of the project, The SHPO staff will review the work for compliance with the standards during the review of your grant applications. We also want to know specific work that you are applying for the grant funding for. If there is no other work taking place on the property aside from the work that you are applying for grant funding, then you can clarify that in the second box under the description of grant funded work. Next, you will need to provide an estimated project timeline that covers the key points such as the start date, key benchmarks, and the completion date. While these are an estimate, you should try to be as realistic as possible so that we can be assured that your project can be completed within that 2-year time frame. And you will also need to provide a description of the historic and/or architectural significance. Basically, we want to know why your building is important within the local, state, and/or a national context. If your property is already listed in the National Register, this is information you can pull straight from the nomination itself. If your property is not listed, this section does not require overly in-depth research, but the more information you can provide, the better. And finally, you will need to provide the physical description of the property and information on construction and alterations. For example, the building you see on this slide could be described as a 3-story, 3-bay masonry commercial building. The second story or the first story contains 3 separate commercial spaces and an entrance to the upper floor. And the second story retains 6 large 4/4 single hung windows with a rounded lintel detailing. The third story is defined by a mansard roof form and central pediment dormer. Again, this just needs to be a general description of the building's appearance and materials. You don't need to use technical terms unless you know them. Then provide a brief description of any known construction techniques or alterations to the building. If you aren't sure the exact date an alteration was made, you can make an educated guess if appropriate. In section 4, you'll be providing a description of the urgency of need. This should cover anything from significant structural issues or other physical deterioration to financial need or need for use of the building. This section will be weighed more heavily during our review process, so be sure to tell the story and make a case for why the building is in jeopardy and why the project needs to move forward with this funding. Section 5 contains some of the most pertinent information to the application and review. Here you'll provide information on the public benefit from the completed project and how this project will help advance the economic vitality and revitalization in the community. We're looking to fund projects that have a significant community or public use and will have an impact on the community as a whole. Projects without any public use will not be considered for funding. We encourage you to contact myself and the other Landmark staff to discuss your project ahead of completing the application if you're unsure that it will meet these requirements. And this section will also ask you to provide information on the building and how often it will be open for public use. Due to the current COVID circumstances, we do understand that some buildings have a more limited public use or capacity during this time. So we want you to describe your intended public use outside of any current COVID restrictions as well. There's also a budget worksheet and grant request form. The application includes the fillable table with a number of different expense categories such as personnel, volunteer labor, consultant fees, contractor fees, travel, office supplies and materials, equipment, and other expenses. For each of these, there are boxes to fill in the detailed information on the expense and the cost value associated with each of those categories. The final column in the table is where we ask you to detail what, if any, of these costs are covered by matching or in-kind funds. While this grant program does not require a match from the applicant, it is important information to know if you're awarded as you work through the grant agreement process with the state. Additional details on the budget worksheet can be found in the application instructions, but as always, please contact me if you have any questions. Then the second page of your budget worksheet will include a box where you'll detail and list any additional funding sources and the amounts that you have secured for the project. This should include any personal or organizational cash funds or funding from an outside source such as other organizations, the municipality, commercial or other private funding. Again, this section is just for additional funding that has already been secured as of the March 31st deadline. You will also want to provide confirmation of that secured funding with your application. At the end of this section, you will total the overall project costs, including both eligible and ineligible expenses, and then make your grant request. It's important to remember that the grant request should be between $5,000 and $50,000, and the amount should be justified in the information you provide in the worksheet. Only those costs related to the project's capital expenses, survey work, and soft costs such as construction documents and conditions assessments, and potentially National Register expenses are eligible for the giver funding. And your project does need to wait to begin until you've been approved and awarded. This slide provides some examples of your eligible versus your ineligible expenses. Again, your eligible expenses are capital improvement costs. So remember, those are things that are permanently attached or part of your building. So if you were to ever vacate that property, it's something you wouldn't be taking with you. Things that are included, but not limited to this list, are roofing, window or door repair or replacement when applicable, storefront repair, systems installations or upgrades, weatherization, and structural and stability work. Some of your ineligible expenses include your personnel or salaries, which is part of what's included in your budget worksheet. Things such as travel, gas, and meals for people working on your project, unless included within a contractor's total fee. Office equipment and supplies that are purchased for your organization or your business, any equipment and tools, and then furniture and decor that you use within the building is not eligible, and then any landscaping. In addition to the application form, you will need to supply letters of support, photographs, drawings, product specifications, a map, and the application checklist as applicable. You are not required to submit letters of support, but we highly recommend doing this. This shows public support from the municipality and the community at large, which helps justify the public benefit and impact of your project. Letters should be submitted electronically with your application, but if for some reason you aren't able to get that letter with your application, it should still be emailed to me at mclem@landmarksociety.org. And the letters should all reference the project that is applying for the giver grant funding. Photographs of the entire property, including the exterior and interior, need to be submitted. The number of photographs will depend on the size of the building and the complexity of your project. In general, a photograph that shows the view of each exterior side of the building, and then at least 1 or 2 photographs of each interior space, showing as much of the room as possible from floor to ceiling, are sufficient. Since photographs will be submitted electronically, each photo file should be labeled with the project or building name, and then an underscore and the view of what we're looking at. For example, the photograph on your screen could be labeled as Maston's _ north and west elevations. An example of a photograph label can also be found in the application instructions. Drawings and sketches are needed if your project proposes changes to the building layout, the design, the storefront. Then you will need to provide existing relevant demolition and proposed drawings that will be reviewed with your project application. And then specifications are if your project includes replacement or new features such as new windows or roofing, you will need to submit product specification information on the proposed replacement material. And typically you can find this information through the manufacturer's website, and contractors or other professionals can also help you find this information. And then to help the grant reviewers ensure that your property is located within an eligible county and then within an eligible town or village, we also request that you provide a map with the location of your property clearly marked. This can be as simple as pulling up a Google map and marking your property location with the little red dot that shows up over it when you search that property address. And we do ask that you zoom out just a little bit so that we can see the context surrounding your building and not just your building itself on the map. And finally, the application checklist. The very last page of your application form is the application checklist. This is to help you ensure that all the required materials are being submitted with your application. And there's they each have little check boxes in front of them, so you can mark them off as you finish everything and add it to your application. Once received, the application will be reviewed by Landmark and SHPO staff, and then you'll be contacted if any clarification or additional information is needed. Applications will then be reviewed by the Grant Review Committee. Applications will be evaluated for the information provided, with a priority set on public benefit and impact, the urgency of need, and that your scope of work complies with the standards. All work ongoing at the property and that is funded by the grant must comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards. These standards are guidelines for the treatment of historic properties that are set forth by the National Park Service and are used when reviewing state and federally funded projects to ensure the protection of historic properties. The key points of the standards are that buildings are used for their historic purpose or a new purpose that does not require significant alterations to the historic building, that you retain historic materials and features, and that when deteriorated beyond repair, that the materials and features be replaced in kind to match the existing. And finally, that if any alterations or additions are being proposed, that they not destroy the historic character of the building, and that the new materials or additions need to be compatible with the historic character of your building. As mentioned, eligible properties must be either currently listed or determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. This is a list overseen by the National Park Service for properties, structures, sites, landscapes, and objects that hold historic significance at a local, state, or national level. Listing in the National Register is an honorary designation and does not restrict a private property owner from what they can do, unless there's state or federal funding involved. National Register listings also promote local heritage tourism and economic development. They raise awareness and pride in a community's past. And the most common reason for a National Register listing is the eligibility for the state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credit programs and other preservation grant funding. I'll wrap up the presentation with a couple of reminders. First, again, your round 1 applications are due March 31st. If you're applying under round 2 of the grant, those applications are due September 30th. But again, remember, applications going out now are for round 1 grant funding. Any questions about the Genesee Valley Rural Revitalization or GVRR grant should be directed to me at mclem@landmarksociety.org, and you can see my email on the screen right now. If you have questions about your project eligibility or the project itself, or just the application, please do reach out to me. Our staff is available to answer questions and provide support through this process. We don't want you to get overwhelmed. We want to give out the money, and we want you to have great projects and great applications. We can also review your application prior to the deadline and make recommendations for a more complete or stronger application. I do ask that if you request a pre-review of your application, that you get that into me at least a week, if not more, in advance. 2 weeks in advance would be ideal. Again, this is because if everybody's asking for this, we need the time to get through your application and provide you good feedback, and then you'll need the time to make those changes to your application to make it even stronger. And with that, I hope that you've gained some insight and understanding of this new and great program that we have received funding for. And we'll open this time up for questions. Please type your questions into the chat box. Again, if you don't know about this feature, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, a little box will pop up. You should see the one that says chat. You can click on that, and you want to make sure you're sending that question to everybody, and Caitlin will be able to read through those for you. Again, we do ask that you keep muted during this time unless there's a question that we need clarity on. Caitlin may ask you to unmute and clarify your question. Again, remember, if you have questions, please contact me. We are here to help, and we want you to have a really great success through this grant round.
Great, thank you, Megan. We have some questions that have come in that we'll get started on. I'm just copying a couple of them over. So we have a couple of questions about state-owned sites. So if a site is owned by OPRHP and say it's operated by an affiliated friends group, are those folks eligible to apply?
I'll go ahead and answer that one. What I'm hearing from the top is that yes, that's okay if the friends group is the applicant. It'll require a little bit of coordination on our end, but I believe that that will be possible, and I can get some more details on that.
Great. And this question came in before we covered it, but I'll just reiterate. It was, is a 501c3 status a prerequisite to apply? No, it is one of the eligible applicants. You can be a 501c3, a municipality, or you can be a private owner. Next question, would photos of buildings be appropriate for the application?
Historic photos, you could submit some of those with your application if it helps show what the building looked like, what you're trying to bring it back to. But the main photographs that we will need with the application are current photographs.
Yes, and so, you know, like Megan said in her presentation, overall photos are very important so we can get a sense of what the building and its context is. And, you know, if there's a specific, you know, let's say you're applying to do some work on your storefront, you know, make sure you get some closer up photos of the storefront itself, which you're applying. Would a town hall be eligible to apply?
Yes, so a town hall would be eligible. Local units of government, such as the town, the village, or even the county, are eligible to apply for this grant, and that can cover their own buildings as well.
Are rounds 1 and 2 totally separate, or is round 2 a continuation of applications that passed round 1?
I guess I can take that one. They are separate. They are separate, but if perchance you are not awarded in the first round, you can put your application in again. There's probably a good reason why you were not awarded, so you probably want to discuss that with us, and we can see how you can either change the project up a little bit or do a better application.
And that's a good point. We're not going to automatically roll over applications to round 2. So if you don't get funded in round 1, do reapply, and we'll, you know, we'll be able to give you some feedback, like Larry said.
Round 2, just to clarify too, round 2 applications will become available once the round 1 awardees have been announced. So if you're not, if you think that you don't want to apply in round 1 for some reason and want to wait till round 2, or you don't get awarded in round 1 and want to apply, be on the lookout for the new application announcement, probably sometime late June, early July.
Realistically, how long, this might be a question for Fran, how long will the New York State contract take to complete after award? So, you know, when can folks anticipate getting started with construction?
I don't have a clear answer for that right now, and I'm sorry. We will work on making the contracts as soon as possible. These are reimbursement grants as well, so the expectation is that you'll submit for expenses after you've already incurred them. But that is something that we will work on individually with each grant awardee.
Great. Can the application be on 2 buildings Or if you have two buildings for which you want to apply, should you do two separate applications? For example, the person asking this is asking specifically about the Macedon Historical Society, where they have an academy building and a Grange building.
I think overall, if they're two very separate properties and they're not connected, you should probably submit an application for each one, a separate application for each building. However, I think we had determined if you own two buildings that are connected, such as like two Main Street buildings, and they're interconnected and will be used for the same project, basically, that submitting those on one application would be okay.
So, if you've got a specific situation, just feel free to reach out to Megan to get, a specific answer on your property. Would seating for an opera house restoration be an eligible expense? The seating would be permanently installed.
I'd say yes. I see the head going, right?
Yeah, so although, seating might be looked at as furniture, which we said wasn't eligible, in these cases, when it's installed like that, and it's part of the actual use of using an auditorium or a theater, then it becomes an eligible expense. But, if you were to install I don't know, if you were to install a china cabinet for something, bolting it to the ground won't make that an eligible expense.
Okay, so we have a question about the total. So the total grant that the state parks has received from National Park Service for this program is $750,000. And someone's made the observation that that's not a lot of money for the large region that we're looking at. So do we envision that the awards will be smaller than what is applied for? I think we're going to have a grant review committee who will be making award decisions. You may, if you receive an award, you may get something below what you're asking, but the grant committee is not going to give you an award that's so small that it's not useful. We want to make these projects happen. So, if you are applying for a $20,000 roof, most likely the grant committee is not going to give you a $5,000 grant, right? So, so that's the answer to that question. Are there minority and women-owned business requirements?
Yes, there are. We are working on putting together rules for the bidding process, because there will have to be some kind of formal procurement for finding contractors for these projects. And it is expected that you will do your best to find contractors that are MWBE. But we can give you more information on that as we move through the process and as you apply for the program.
So we have two related questions here about what is the difference between round 1 and round 2. There really isn't a difference. It's just an opportunity to give folks, some more time and to just split up the review process. So they just have two different deadlines. And yes, the $750,000 is going to be split between those two more or less evenly, depending on how applications go for round 1 for the 2 rounds. Next question, is Allegheny County always included in this application? And I should clarify, because we've gotten a couple of questions. This grant program that the state, that OPRHP has received funding for, this is a one-time thing. So even though we have these 2 rounds of funding, we've got this $750,000, and once we spend it, that's it. So it's not like this is an ongoing program. Certainly, if this is a successful program, we'll apply again. But so this is really just this round 1 and round 2 this year. That's it for the program. But Allegheny County, there's a question of if it's always included. Yes, for these 2 rounds, Allegheny County is any properties in Allegheny County are eligible to apply. And Megan, you'll like this because you've been answering a lot of emails about this question. What are we if we are in a village population and the population of the village exceeds that 4,000 requirement, but the town that surrounds the village is under the 10,000 requirement?
Sure. So under this eligibility requirement, we are distinguishing between villages and towns. So a village is an incorporated entity within the town, meaning it does legally have a separate municipality. And therefore, if you are within the village limits, you do need to meet the village population requirement, not the town. But if your property is within the town outside of the village limits, then you would be looking at coming in under the town population requirement. And again, that's because a village is a legally incorporated entity which has a separate municipality. So I know that there have been some people who said that they get funding from the town still or things like that, but you would still have to meet the village requirement. If you have a population, either village or town, that is slightly above that 4,000 or 10,000 as they're listed, please do contact me still on that. There may be a way for you to still be eligible, but again, we really are trying to stick with that 4,000 and 10,000 number.
And I did notice somebody mentioned 11,800 or something like that, and that's too high. I mean, it's just sort of a little bit above.
Pretty much, so, if your population goes like more than 500 people above that 4,000 or 10,000, then we are going to tell you that you're not eligible. And then if you are above those numbers, but kind of within a wiggle range, just do know that the projects that do completely meet that requirement may end up scoring a little bit higher during the review process, but you wouldn't necessarily not be able to be considered.
Next question, and this might be a Larry Fran question, tag team. We have applied for a DRI grant and we are waiting to hear. Timing therefore may be an issue. Should we wait for the September round when we will hopefully have an answer about the DRI grant?
I think that would make sense because, you know, with DRI, if you happen to be lucky enough to be awarded it, and you're within the DRI plan, and there's a large match that we're seeing through that, it could put your application in a better place. So I would say that you should. What do you think, Fran?
I would agree with that. The other thing that I would say is that for this grant, any other grant, right now we have a March 31st deadline, which is coming up quickly. And then we also have the September deadline. It is never too early to get started working on a grant application, regardless of which round you would like to apply for, especially because for this one, we're going to be asking for information to put together determinations of eligibility. So figure out what makes sense for you and your project timeline, but don't just sit around and wait if you decide that round 2 actually makes more sense for you. And now is the best time to chat with us, get your questions answered. But that's always my general advice for grants of any kind is don't wait until the last minute. So.
Right.
And in terms of when we expect awards to be announced, Megan, we're looking at June or July, correct? Late June?
Right. Round 1, your applications are due March 31st, and then late June, early July, the announcement will be made for awardees. And then with round 2, just to give you a heads up on that, round 2 again would be due, the application due September 30th, and we'd be making award announcements probably sometime in December.
And, you know, related, this goes back to an earlier question, how long does it take to hear back and get permission to start? So we just mentioned when you'll hear if you were awarded a grant, and then from there, you'll have to execute an agreement with OPRHP, with the state. So we're just not sure at this point, you know, what the time frame is on that. Now we went over this in the presentation. How is historic eligibility determined? So your property, if it's not already listed in the National Register of Historic Places, it may be officially eligible or it may not have a determination. So you'll reach out to Megan and she will coordinate with Fran and her colleagues at OPRHP to get a determination as to whether or not the property is eligible for National Register listing. Did I miss anything, Megan? Anything you want to add?
No, I guess I would just add on, if you do think that's you, if you're not sure of the status, or you know there's not an eligibility determination yet, again, do get in touch with me as soon as possible. I would even say if you can do it within the next week or so. We are compiling a list of properties that need determinations, and we will be reaching back out to you to provide us with some information like photographs and a little bit of history on the building for the determination to be made. So the sooner you reach out to me and can let me know, like, we're going to want to know the address of your property at least, so that we can begin that process. And I'm also able then to check them to make sure that you are within an eligible village or town, and make sure that you meet those requirements before we start the determination process.
Yeah, I would add a couple things to this as well. We are collecting information for properties that need determinations of eligibility in order to help make this process as efficient as possible. We have several colleagues and staff members in our survey and National Register unit that are representatives for these counties that these grant projects qualify for. And in order to make this process as efficient as possible, we're going to be helping shepherd this process instead of just having our colleagues get hit with all these requests at once. Some things that you should anticipate having to provide: definitely photographs of the building. Historic photographs may be helpful if you have them. I don't think they're required. You should be prepared to make site plans or floor plans, even if they're just simple sketches, so that our staff has an idea of what we're looking at. And also, if there have been any alterations made to the building over time, if you know any particular history about it, such as the builder, the architect, dates of construction, all of those things will be exceptionally helpful for putting together a determination of eligibility. So if you want to start thinking about those things in advance, that would be very much advisable.
And we also do ask that if you have a building that does not have a determination yet and is not listed, that you send requests for this process only for buildings that you are planning to apply for the grant for. Otherwise, if it's not something that you are going to apply through this grant program for, there is a little bit different process for determining eligibility through the state office. So we do ask that you limit your requests for a determination to buildings that you actually are going to submit an application for.
So would we have a better chance of grant approval if we secure our National Register of Historic Places designation first?
That would be no. So that's just one of the eligibility requirements. But when it comes down to it, the biggest push and part of the scoring for these projects will be your public use, community use, and the benefit to the community, as well as urgency of need, and then that your work meets the Secretary's standards. So the eligibility or being listed in the National Register doesn't really give you a leg up at all, because that's something that every project applying will have to either have that designation or be determined for it.
Okay, so this is a question we can't really answer. Is round 2 normally more competitive than round 1? This is the first time we've had this grant program, so we don't have past history to base that on. So I don't know. I would say, do what you think works best for you and your timing and workload. If applying for an owner-operated National Register listed hotel and the owner lives in an apartment in the building, is the project eligible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because you still have that public use or the commercial use with it. So it's not only your owner-occupied residence. So it's really just owner-occupied. We mean kind of like a single family home that just the owner lives in, and there's no commercial or public use of that building.
Right, and so again, with your application, you really want to emphasize whether it's a Main Street commercial building, a town hall, some kind of maybe a Grange hall. You really want to emphasize that this grant award will have a public benefit to your community. So, how does the public use your property? Is there a cafe in there that's a gathering space for the community? Are there public events held there? That type of thing.
And I would say, to add on to that, because we've had questions about church buildings, technically churches are not one of the eligible building types for this program. However, consideration can be made for eligibility if the church is used, has a public benefit beyond the religious services and religious use of the building. So for example, again, if your church, if there's outside organizations that use your church, or you host community events, or the church hall is also used as the community center, something like that, you would really want to make the argument for that. You really want to make sure you touch on those in your application, because the church itself is actually not an eligible applicant. But if you have a community use and you make a really good argument for that community use, then those would be considered eligible applicants.
So we have two related questions about getting the money. Fran, can you explain a little bit more about what reimbursable expenses works and how getting the actual grant money works?
Yeah, and this will become clearer as we build contracts for awardees, but essentially a reimbursable grant means that you receive the funding after you've incurred those expenses. So you will pay your contractor for work completed, and you'll submit documentation that has to do with the work that's been completed, and some other things that discuss what you're submitting expenses for. And then that is how we will reimburse or give you back the grant funding that you're owed in that sense.
And in your experience, Fran, how do folks who get these kind of grants, like EPF grants that OPRHP administers, if you don't have that money up front, how can you work around that?
That's a great question. That's something that I have much more experienced colleagues that I would lean on for answers like that. And if that's something that you're concerned about, then definitely reach out to me and we can talk about that on a case-by-case basis. I don't want to, because what works for someone else, what works for one person might not work well for someone else. And so we want to make sure that we're giving you the individual attention and answers that you need. So definitely reach out to me if you have concerns about that.
Great. Do folks need multiple quotes? For example, someone's looking at doing a lift elevator and there aren't that many vendors out there.
Yes, I am working on putting together information about the procurement process for contractors for this specific grant program, because we have to make sure that we are advising subgrantees to comply with federal standards as well as New York State standards. So if you have reached out to me about bidding and I haven't gotten back to you yet, I have not forgotten. We are working on it. But basically you are going to be expected to demonstrate that you have selected quotes from different vendors in the area and that you are following procedures in documenting how and why you're choosing certain vendors or contractors for certain expenses. And so when the grants are actually awarded and it gets time to go through that process, we will give you all of the information that you need to know. But that is something that you should be aware of upfront, is that you will have to find different quotes for different services.
And then someone asked, if we don't receive funding in round one, will we receive specific feedback that resulted in denial? Yes, we will give you feedback. And it may be as simple as it was really competitive and you just didn't make the cut. But yes, we will give you whatever feedback we can from the grant review committee. Next question is, we addressed this before. So if your village, if you are in a village and your village exceeds the population limit, but your town does not, you're still in the village. That's the legal municipality in which your building is located and where that building pays taxes and all of that. So it's you're either in the village or you're in the town. If you're in the village, you pay attention to the village population. I know that that seems weird and can get confusing, but just keep in mind, villages and towns are separate governmental entities. When you speak of need in your grant application, are you talking about the building or building owner?
That would be, I mean, it can be both. So we would want to know urgency of need, as in, you know, is your building deteriorating, or, you know, for example, is your roof going to collapse, something like that? Is the paint failing on your building, things like that. So you do want to address the need for the building. So basically, why does this work you're applying for need to be done? But you can also address the need of the applicant. If you don't have, you know, if you need this funding to make the project happen, you want to make that clear. Things like that. So both, but you definitely do want to touch on the need of the physical building itself.
Next question, if an applicant is already working with an architect or contractor, are they required to get other quotes?
Yes. Yeah, you will have to do that, and we will be able to provide you with forms and documentation to demonstrate that you've gone and collected other quotes, how you're tracking and how you're selecting, those kinds of things.
Okay. Will grants be awarded to LGBT/minority owned businesses in the application process? You know, I would certainly say if you're the property owner or there's a use in your building that somehow is associated with an underserved or marginalized group, that's information you can share. I don't think that that's going to be a specific scoring criteria in our rubric, but definitely, you know, let us know relevant information like that. Let's see, are professional services exempt from the bidding requirement?
No. No, they are not. Services as well as products or anything that goes into this project all has to go through the same bidding process.
And I had another question about how the funding will be divvied up. Again, we anticipate it's going to be about half and half for round 1 and round 2. If the village was awarded a New York State anchor grant for our buildings, can we still apply for a grant for one of the buildings? I think that is a maybe a Fran question. Did we determine if you can have 2 sets of state funding?
I don't think we've been asked that question before, and that is something that I would want to clarify. So if you want to reach out to me directly, you know, we can get the details of that grant program and how that might work.
Okay. Megan, here's one for you. Is a parochial school eligible?
So school buildings are eligible. Again, the building type, while we do have that list of eligible building types that we're looking for, the real part of this grant is the public use. So if there's a public use to the building and a public benefit, then yes, it's eligible.
And then our last question, unless we get any last minute ones in. So someone just wants to confirm. So you have a village population of 3,000 is eligible, even though the town population is over 10. That's correct. If your property is in the village boundaries, in the legal boundaries of the village, you're paying attention to the population of the village in which you are located. If you are outside the village in the town, then you're paying attention to the population of the town. We have for Fran, we had a question just come in about the deed restriction if you are awarded a grant. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yep. So a preservation covenant is a binding legal agreement that will stay with the property. And as Megan explained earlier, a preservation covenant is meant to ensure that the historic preservation work that you are performing on the building as part of this grant program, that investment is protected for the next however many years. It could be up to 10, 25 years. It depends on how much funding is awarded. It's we try to look at it as not necessarily a restriction, but just a something that helps protect this historic preservation investment, because again, this is a historic preservation grant program. We want buildings to be preserved according to historic preservation standards. So as Megan mentioned, it will stay with the deed of the property. So if you sell the building or your business leaves and goes to another place, that building will remain protected even if the owners change or something. And it's a very important part of the process. And we will have more information on that as we start awarding these grants and as we start recording preservation covenants on these properties.
Great, thank you. And then so we have another question. Do SUNY populations count towards the population of the village? So what the data that we're using, Megan, which data set did we decide that we're using for population?
So we have been looking at the 2010 census because that's the most recent completed census data. However, I think, Fran, you guys said that for tax credits, you guys use a different one, but I think that it's similar to the census information, correct?
Yeah, we use the American Community Survey as far as census tracts for tax credits, but if there's a specific question about a unique place that we can answer, then let us know.
Yeah, so check, I'll put the link to, you can, because sometimes the numbers are slightly different between the 2010 census and the American Community Survey, which is still under the US Census Bureau. I think it's just maybe usually a little bit more up to date. So you can check both of those and just that'll tell you what the official population is for your village or town. Or you can also reach out to Megan and she'll check for you.
And I just put in all of our emails so that you'll have them in the chat. So those are there as well.
So again, we want to thank you all for joining us. It looks like we've answered all the questions, but if you have any questions, you can always reach out to Megan or any of us, and we'll get your question answered. And we did record this webinar, so it will be up on Landmark Society's YouTube channel. We'll send a link out to all of you, and if you're really bored, you can watch the first webinar, which is the same as this one, but maybe there's some Q&A in there that you find stimulating. But we will send you the link to our YouTube channel probably by the end of this week or early next week.
Great, and we look forward
to reach out to me
getting your applications, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thanks to Megan. Wonderful job, Megan.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.